Joining us now, staff writer at The Atlantic, David Frum. He's out with a new book entitled Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. Thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
David, tell us the big idea on this book. I know most of it was written before the pandemic, but obviously much of it applies even more now.
Yeah.
I begin Trumpocalypse by quoting a column in the Washington Post by a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist just before the vote in 2016. And the columnist said, "Whatever happens, we'll be fine." And that was a common view back then. How much harm could a Donald Trump presidency do? And we now know the answer. And so Trumpocalypse begins by trying to assess that damage. And then it points out, hey, a third of the country is still, despite all the deaths, despite the unemployment, willing to go along with this for cultural revenge, to own noisy women, to show the ungrateful minorities. And what is America as a nation going to do to restore democracy around that one-third who seem to object to democracy as a mode of government? And the book offers suggestions as to how to do that. Practical, achievable, limited, but how do you reballast American democracy when a third of the country seems to be against it?
So David, let me ask you, and we're going to go to Elise Jordan in a second, who I think probably fits into our club as well. I'm obviously a former Republican. I still am a conservative. You're a conservative. Of course, there are a lot of Trumpers who would say that you're a lefty and I'm a lefty, which of course is preposterous because we actually care about policies. There was a time when the Heritage Foundation, when other organizations back in the 80s focused on policy. Now it's mainly focused on anti-Trumpism. And you've got people like Ted Cruz who compared Donald Trump to Mussolini during the campaign, as you say in your book. Now he's carrying his water day in and day out. Lindsey Graham, who said if the Republican Party picks this guy, they will be destroyed and they will deserve it. Now he carries water for this guy. I mean, there are 1,000 quotes from Lindsey. You look at the White House press secretary who trashed Donald Trump repeatedly. Now, just to get her 15 minutes, she's now completely twisting and contorting herself to be, I think it was Jonah Goldberg who said to be a Twitter troll.
Yeah. Well, this ship is sinking. I wrote Trumpocalypse on the assumption that Donald Trump would probably lose the 2020 election. I thought he would lose because of the recession he was causing with his trade war with China, and I'm very much worried he'd get us into a shooting war with Iran. But now we know the exact nature of the Trumpocalypse that was coming, and I don't think a president survives with 10, 15, 20% unemployment. So we know the ship is sinking. And the question to begin to think about now is how do we restore, after the Trump ship sinks, how do we prevent the ship of state from going down after Trump? How do we build a workable two-party system in which we have two parties that are both committed to democratic norms and democratic outcomes? And I try to offer some ideas to do that. And I want to focus on what can be achieved. You're not going to get rid of the Electoral College, but you can write a new Voting Rights Act. You're not going to be able to get rid of, to change the way the Supreme Court works. But what you can do is make sure that you have a more independent Department of Justice.
Elise Jordan, you have a question?
David, dealing specifically with the question of restoring American democracy, I'm concerned about the role of norms within our democracy, and how do we get back the norms that were previously followed because an office holder would respect the dignity of the office, not because it was necessarily enshrined in law. And how do you propose that we go about having some national rebirth of respecting norms?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a hard question. Some of those norms will have to be enforced by being codified into formal law. So the old norm, one of the things I've been warning about for a long time is that many of the corrupt things that Donald Trump has done are not illegal. One of the things that the book talks about is why the Mueller investigation failed. And at the center of it was the thing that we wanted to know is, does Donald Trump owe a lot of money to Russian interests? Mueller didn't look at, because Mueller went looking for prosecutable crimes, and it's not a crime for an American businessman to owe a lot of money, even to quite dirty people in Russia. So the way we're going to get the norms back, and I say this with some sadness, because it's not the ideal solution, is to codify them. We're going to need a law about financial disclosure. We're going to need to go back to those reforms that we enacted after Watergate and bring them 50 years ago. And bring them into the modern era. We're going to need a new era, like from 1974 to 78, where we start taking things that were abuses and we have to start writing laws to say, it's a little bit locking the barn after the horse is gone, I admit. But, there may be new bad horses. So we need to put these things into writing and make them binding.
Tom Nichols has a question. But first, Tom, I want to follow up on that with you. I think you and I probably shared the belief that American institutions were fine, were going to handle this very well, and I think for the most part, actually, they have. But I do agree with David that we need to, there are some things that we need to codify, things that we trusted a president to actually carry through based on political norms or constitutional norms that Donald Trump has shown we can no longer do. And for me, David brought it up, step one is a more independent Justice Department for Republicans and Democrats and independents alike. What are your thoughts? And then feel free to go to David with a question.
I think, like David, I'm uncomfortable with having to codify things that we should be observing as norms. To me, that a constitutional republic isn't governed by making sure that you've covered every possible contingency through some kind of legislation and sanction. That's like having a marriage where you sign a prenup that says you're gonna love your spouse and be considerate and remember his or her birthday. If you have to legislate that, you probably shouldn't be married. And I think we're heading into a similar situation where, tens of millions of Americans just don't care that the president is somehow financially compromised by the Russians, then writing it into law isn't going to help you very much. But with that said, I think at least as a short-term corrective, we're going to have to codify at least some of those things to bring back some transparency, to give some of the American public and people overseas who are watching us some faith in that the system can work again. My question for David, and the thing I'm worried about, is on the assumption that Trump loses, and I didn't used to worry about this. I like Joe said, I had a lot of faith that the institutions are resilient. But I'm looking at the period between now and January when a new president is sworn in, and I'm thinking that, especially looking at the kind of tweets and behavior that we were talking about earlier, there are a lot of things this president can do to basically set everything on fire on his way out the door. What are the things you're most concerned about in the next 6 months, on the assumption that Trump loses? What are the things he could do that would be really deeply constitutional, aside from starting a war, obviously, but what are the things that would be really deeply damaging that you're most worried about?
Well, I think he will issue a spate of pardons to his intimates, to his relatives, and to himself. We have never had to test the question whether a president can pardon himself. I expect that we will be testing that question. But the attack on democracy that we've seen is not a Trump-specific problem. Look, we have states where with 45% of the vote, the Republican Party, and it's always the Republican Party, gets close to 65% of the seats. And it's not just south of the Mason-Dixon line. Michigan and Wisconsin are very bad actors. We've got a census coming up in 2020. We're probably going to have some Democratic gains in 2020 at the state level. How do you make sure that state governments reflect the votes that are cast? And the book has some ideas about doing that. One of the things I suggest is that the Democrats use their gains in 2020 in the states where they do well, North Carolina perhaps, Wisconsin perhaps, and draw two maps. Say, here's what we could do to you. Here's what we should do to you. Now, we can do either map. If you Republicans will use your power in Texas and Georgia to draw fair maps, we will use our power in North Carolina and Wisconsin to draw fair maps. If not, not. I mean, it's crazy that in the United States, politicians draw their own maps, and I would like to do away with that, but that's not practical. What is practical is to restore deterrence, because the courts since 2013 have stepped away from any role as guardians of democracy in the United States. They gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, and they allowed the most extreme partisan gerrymandering in the last session of the court. They say, okay, so long as it's not racial, but of course, because race and partisanship so match in the United States, whenever you do partisan gerrymandering, you're of course doing racial gerrymandering.
Eddie Glaude.
David, this argument sounds extraordinarily fascinating to me. So I want to go back to how you framed it. And that is in terms of this third of the country that seems to be against democracy in so many ways. And we could tell a story of the country that suggests or that involves how we have in some ways compromised with that third and the way in which those compromises have been certain groups have to bear the burden of its implication. So what do you do? How do you respond to the fact that you have so many Americans who are, shall we say, not necessarily committed to democracy in all of its details?
Well, thank you. I describe in the book lots of evidence about how when you tell Republicans, you know, the Russians intervened in the election, do you care? You discover an extraordinary percentage of people on the Republican side who say, I don't care. And the reason they don't care, it seems to me, is that they do not feel a strong enough bond of nationhood with people who are different from them in important ways, that they feel more in common with a Russian Trump supporter than they do with an American non-Trump supporter. And so the last half of the book talks about how do you reconnect the bonds of nationhood in a place where they have been weakened. And I've got some suggestions for that. You have to sort of almost all of the economic gains of the past decade have accrued to knowledge centers, big cities and university towns. You have to find some way to reignite economic activity in non-metropolitan America. I think you need a new approach to healthcare that makes Americans feel, as Britons do and as Canadians do, that they have something tangible that marks them off from people who are not Americans. Not that makes them better, but just, you know, if you're American, you get this. And if you're not American, you don't get it. And it's a healthcare guarantee. And at the same time, I think along with thickening the social insurance state, you have to restrict immigration more to make sure that it's to become a member of the national community is more difficult than it used to be. You can't just show up and claim the benefits of nationhood. The benefits of nationhood have to be earned, but once earned, those benefits are real and they're available to everybody. And that above all includes the right to vote. You know, one more sentence on this. People of my cohort were raised to believe that the story of American democracy is that the vote got wider and wider and wider. The 15th Amendment, it's extended on, you can no longer deny the vote on the basis of race. You can no longer deny it to women. We make the Senate popularly elected, up and up and up. But that's not the way it was. It has been contested. It has gone backwards as often as forwards. And we are in a period where that right to vote has been going backwards for some time, and we have to now perpetuate and constitutionalize the right to vote.
All right. The book is Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. David Frum, thank you so much. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.